back once again, all of you nerds. This is Nerdy by Nature. I'm one of your hosts, Agent Smith, aka Tyler.
And I'm Charlie, aka Captain Rogers.
And if you're picking up with us where we left off on our last episode, so of course we did a review of Watchmen, the new TV series that debuted on HBO that follows the graphic novel, same name, Watchmen, and the movie as well. We did a full review, hit the highlights of those, and compared and contrasted between the differences. And we are very self-aware that we've been talking about Alan Moore quite a bit on most of our episodes.
Right.
So we wanted to go ahead and put that to bed and move on to a new pasture of discussion. We figured the best way to do that would be to stick with the same route here in the Alan Moore verse, that being V for Vendetta, the graphic novel and the film. So in this episode, we're going to go ahead and, spoiler alert, go over both of those, hit the highlights, same process. And we are, as of right now, November the 1st, 11 days away from the exciting launch of Disney+.
Oh, yeah.
So we are ready for that to come. All kinds of new and exciting shows we'll be able to talk about. But before we get to all that, let's go ahead and dive right in to the V for Vendetta breakdown. And of course, as we did with The Watchmen, we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the graphic novel and the film. Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, Charlie, I mean, the graphic novel in this case, it's kind of odd because with The Watchmen, both the graphic novel and the movie are very good. And up until the end, of that particular film,
right,
it's pretty much the same, one of the better adaptations that we've seen from graphic novel to the movie. I don't know that you could really honestly say that in this case for V for Vendetta.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I will say they both start out the same way, and it almost looks like it's going to be the same scenario as The Watchmen in that it's going to be a direct adaptation. But after that first few minutes of the movie, it kind of takes a turn, and then it really doesn't follow the graphic novel very much at all, in my opinion. I mean,
I would have to agree with that in the sense that, like you said, it does. They start out practically carbon copy. We've got Evie Hammond, one of the main characters, getting ready in her room. Mm-hmm. And she's listening to the news, same way that she is in the film. And then, of course, she is done putting on her makeup, and which I guess is kind of a poetic way. She's also putting on a mask. And, of course, we see in the movie, V for Vendetta, he puts on his mask. And so she goes out for the evening to meet a co-worker or supervisor and is, of course, met by fingermen of the law at the time. Same concept in the graphic novel. And that's where we're introduced to this character, this masked vigilante V, codename V, as the government refers to him as, and she has an altercation with the fingerman. We can tell right away, both in the graphic novel and in the film, that these guys aren't really what you would call quality lawmen. They're men that think they're above the law. They're a part of this problem that is this corrupt system of quote-unquote, air quotes, justice.
Right.
And so you know right away that in both the graphic novel and the film that Evie is in trouble. And so, of course, you enter V, the masked vigilante. He's kind of like a London's Batman, if you will. I don't know if it's the best way to describe him, but he's sort of a masked crusader of sorts.
Right. Yes. No, I wouldn't say that he's necessarily a good guy, though.
Right. As at least Batman has some sense of altruism to him, whereas V is definitely more anarchy or anarchist at the end of the day. But nevertheless, he's able to save her from that situation, and of course she's thankful. And in the graphic novel, you right away can tell that this is a very intelligent and self-aware masked vigilante. It's not just some guy running around the streets of London all willy-nilly.
Right.
Like, he's got a purpose, he's got a point. And so, of course, he takes her, after he's able to apprehend her and save her, asks if she likes music. And again, from graphic novel to movie, we still are on that same stream of flow, where panel to panel, pretty much the same. And so
I would say a notable difference between the movie and the graphic novel is that in the graphic novel, Evie is obviously a prostitute, and to the point where she even propositions the gentlemen that are attacking her, whereas in the movie, that's never hit on, and I didn't get the idea that she was ever like that or is like that.
No, and in the film, she's just a worker, employee for the British television network, and so it's really not implied at all that she's got any kind of past in that light. And the other big difference, and I'm glad that you brought this up, of course, with Evie as a whole, is, of course, in the graphic novel, she is younger. She's about 16 or so, on the cusp of 17, whereas in the film, it's never actually said exactly what her age is, but we are led to believe, or it's heavily implied, that she's already come of age, and she's probably early 20s.
Yeah, so I would say that early 20s would be where I would place her.
So it's a little bit different, and it slightly changes the dynamic of Evie Hammond's character and the relationship between herself and V overall. Because in the graphic novel, it's a situation where he helps her become a woman, he helps her become this different person, which he does the same thing in the film. But as far as their overall connection goes, there's kind of a noticeable difference.
Definitely.
Because he's more of a, I guess you could say, father figure in the graphic novel. Whereas in the movie, I don't want to say he's a love interest per se, but I could easily see how somebody might get that vibe from watching the film.
I would say that there's kind of like a feeling, or it starts to feel like it might go that way, but it never really does.
No, it never really gets there. And it might even just be in the sense of, love has many forms, so it could just be in the sense of, she loves V, or the idea of V, and that's why almost like a friend.
True.
So there are, multiple different facets of love in that aspect. And so from there, that's where we take a bit of a turn in the graphic novel and the film. And so the graphic novel dives a little bit deeper into character development, such as Evie, such as V, and the High Chancellor Adam Susan, which of course we find is there's a lot of stark differences between the graphic novel and the film. And I think the reasoning for that is because V for Vendetta is a very dense graphic novel, which is par for the course for Alan Moore.
Definitely.
But to try to adapt that to film is pretty difficult, especially when you've got all the different moving parts and different subplots and multiple characters that have overarching character types. You can do that in the film, but it's hard to pull off. And we have to think about the time frame when this film was made. It was 2006, which still isn't that long ago, but it was early enough in filmmaking that I don't think we quite were ready for the movie to be made in that way, or I don't know that it would have necessarily been logical to try and cram that into 2.5 hours.
Right, and the movie is 2 hours and 13 minutes, I believe, which is a longer time than you would normally see in movies, but at the same time, it's not near long enough to gather and portray this entire story. I feel like there was a lot more in the novel than there was in the movie, and there was really no way, without doing like a second movie or having a 3+ hour movie, that they were going to be able to fit it all in.
No, and I will say, I think for the time run of the movie, they hit the highlights for the most part, but we still unfortunately got a kind of a watered down version of the graphic novel. And of course, obviously, this is no spoiler alert, none of this sat well with Alan Moore. In fact, when you get to the credits of this particular film, a lot like we had mentioned with the end of the Watchmen TV series, his name is not listed on the credits, and so, which no surprise to anyone.
Right, and I'm not sure that Alan Moore likes any of the movie adaptations of his work, to the point where I would say, why did they even do it? But I guess it was owned by DC. It wasn't owned by Alan Moore. He wrote it, of course, he came up with everything, but it was in partnership with DC. So of course they're going to adapt it and make it into a movie if they see money in it.
Right. Absolutely. But of course, David Lloyd is actually credited towards the end of the film, so it was nice that at least somebody got a little bit of a head nod and not just all DC at the end of the day. But of course, as I mentioned, we see them go forward, and we introduce for the first time after V gives the iconic movie line of the remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. We see fireworks go off. He blows up the Old Bailey, a former symbol of justice, and we're introduced to the High Chancellor Adam Sutler. And the reason I bring his name up is because in the graphic novel, another stark difference, it's actually Adam Susan. And so I'm not really sure why director James McTeague decided to make that slight change, only if maybe to make him sound a little bit more manly. But again, I think that was the whole reason in the graphic novel as to why they had Adam Susan the way that they had it, is because this was this kind of effeminate sounding man that's risen to power, and he's going to take over London.
Right, and in the comic or the graphic novel, they even make fun of his name at one point. I don't remember who it was exactly that does it, but that was a big difference from the movie to the graphic novel, just in that they made a point to make fun of it in the graphic novel, and then in the movie it was a totally different name. So
I think that's just something that we have to accept, that that's a choice that they made. And I had mentioned, of course, that they'd blown up the Old Bailey a few moments ago, and so I want to go back to that because it's again a lot of differences between the graphic novel and the film, as we'll say throughout this episode. Kind of like a broken record. It's one of those where it's quite a difference because in the movie he says that he's looking at the statue and it's, justice has changed its face. It's a symbol he can no longer recognize. And so he blows it up with fireworks. And in the graphic novel, before he does any of that, he actually goes, and I believe it's on page 39 through 41 of the graphic novel, he has an actual conversation with this statue of justice in London. And it's really great, I think, in the graphic novel. And it's a testament to Alan Moore and David Lloyd in their combo with this graphic novel that they created, because at first glance, and when you read it, you kind of think, okay, maybe this guy's just a crazy terrorist.
Right.
He's just a dude, loose cannon with a mask and a cape, and he's talking to this statue. Kind of weird. But if you really reread it and look at it from panel to panel, you get a sense of who V is as this character, who he is as the protagonist, who he is as somebody that once believed in justice and what it stood for and the truth,
Right.
and sought it out and had this relationship with justice and with the truth. And more or less, he feels like he's been slighted, or, want to take it from a relationship standpoint, been cheated on by justice. And that justice is now in this new relationship with the High Chancellor, Adam Susan, in the graphic novel. And so he realizes the only way to get back at Lady Justice is to bed a new woman, and that, and that, so to speak, and that new woman's name is Anarchy. And so it's a very poetic, moving scene there in the panel, I should say, in the graphic novel. Whereas in the film, I don't want to say that they glaze over it, but it's just kind of the offhanded remark of, oh, I can't trust her anymore, so I'm defacing her or blowing her up to make a point, to destroy that symbol and bring to light a new one. And from there, in the movie, we shift gears rather quickly right to Evie Hammond working for the BTN, the British Television Network, and we see her talking with a friend. They're already doing spin coverage on the news of how the Old Bailey was supposed to be blown up. It was a scheduled demolition, but that the fireworks were a bit of a surprise. And so, of course, all of her co-workers are like, well, no, that's a load of bollocks. We can't believe any of that. I was there last night. I saw that wasn't the case. There was no demolition. Like, some of the people we can tell already know, like, no, we can't believe everything that the news tells us, and this is just ridiculous. It's getting crazy fabricated. And, of course, at that moment, we start to realize that V has already set forth in motion his plans to try and infiltrate and take over this TV network. He's already sent a bunch of masks and capes. And he comes up the elevator fully strapped with a bomb, ready to go. And so they, of course, walk him right into the...
Yeah, and I'll say that I didn't really think about it at the time until now, but he kind of reminds me a lot of... I mean, he's not a bad guy and all that, not necessarily, but just in those two instances, it reminded me a lot of the Joker.
I did see that early on.
Just in the fact that he's all about anarchy, and then in the scene in the movie where he has all the masks and capes and everything, he dresses all the good people up in his own outfit to get away, but at the same time, nobody knows who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, so they're all trying to decide whether or not to shoot, or you know what I mean?
I could totally see that, especially in the sense that the Joker, of course, is a master chemist. V for Vendetta, V himself actually is able to create and craft all of these homemade toxins and poisons that he uses to take out those that did him wrong at Larkhill Detention Center, both in the movie and the graphic novel. And he also makes his own fireworks to blow up the Old Bailey and Parliament towards the end. And so, of course, Detective Finch actually brings that up in both the movie and in the graphic novel and says, well, Chancellor, we've done our research, but he's quite good. Any of these materials could be picked up anywhere in London. It's incredibly hard to trace. And so I can actually totally see where you would think that, for sure. And so he gets to the main TV floor there where they're producing the news segment, and so of course he starts to give his own little news segment. And both in the graphic novel and in the film, they're trying to do this positive spin coverage of how everything's fine, no one needs to worry. And of course V, both in the film and the graphic novel, is having none of that. Although it's odd because in the film we get it so early on. I feel like you kind of have to set the tone for the rest of the movie. But of course in the graphic novel there's more character development and layers and panels added.
Everything's more drawn out.
We don't really get this iconic citizen's address until about pages 112 through 118. And there's, again, quite a bit of difference between both messages. In the graphic novel, it's more harsh and coarse, because he really wakes everybody up and says, hey, my worker bees, more or less paraphrasing, of course, you guys have been good workers for this company for a long time, but frankly, you've become kind of monotonous, and you're not really doing all of the work that you could. You're not working as hard hard as you could, and he really just compares London as a country, as a company, and says who elected this upper management.
Right.
They're not the best, they're corrupt, they're unjust, who's to blame, and just really just gives it to the citizens of London and asks them to get on his side, and explains how there can be justice, there can be truth, and we can, have a better company.
Right, and I think in doing that, it made it, him using like a company and explaining all this, it made it a lot easier for just the everyday person to understand and get where he's coming.
Right, and it's, very, very blunt there towards the end of his graphic novel speech, because he says, first off, he gives them a 2-year notice.
Right.
Hey, we have time to right the ship and make everything right. I'm giving you 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you that aren't on board with this, newsflash, you're fired.
Right.
So whereas in the movie, of course, V does a more up-to-date current approach of this government is corrupt, these politicians are unjust, who's to blame? Well, you need only look into a mirror, you have yourself to blame, but I understand that you acted out of fear, and in that fear, you elected these new politicians that are more like dictatorships. They've ruled for so long now, we've lost our way. If you don't know what I'm talking about, he kind of gives them an option more so in the film.
Right.
And says, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I would ask you to let this November the 5th pass like any other, but if you feel what I feel, you see what I see, stand up with me and we can make a better country or build a better tomorrow.
Right.
And that's the end of his message, which, again, the big difference between the film and the graphic novel is in the graphic novel, he gives them 2 years.
Right.
And in the film, we only get a year, which I'm not quite sure why they chose to go with that difference, because as far as time lapse, I feel like you could have shown 2 years time elapse just the same as you would 1 year.
Right.
But again, I guess it's just maybe a way to separate it slightly from the graphic novel or speed it up, maybe not to draw it out for a 2-hour film.
Right, and I do think that like that speech and how they did it, it worked in both the graphic novel and in the movie, and so that was a big part of what worked in both versus a lot of the other stuff.
Right, and to your point, I think in the graphic novel, had it been a lighter citizen's address, it wouldn't quite have fit, because up until that point, the graphic novel itself was very gritty, dark, and it didn't seem like there was much hope for this society, so why would he deliver kind of a lukewarm, hey, we need to change things, come on guys, let's do this. And it's not to say that V's speech in the film is happy by any means. He calls everybody out,
right,
including himself. But I just feel like the delivery was definitely a little bit different from both the graphic novel and in the film. And then, of course, from there, we get introduced to the Shadow Gallery. Of course, he and Evie barely make it out of the TV station in the film. And so we see where essentially V lives and has lived for a long time. He's got all of this beautiful artwork that now, of course, has become outlawed or illegal. It's a very oppressive London society that's painted both in the graphic novel and in the film as well. You're not allowed to have a lot of freedom or individuality.
And he has tons of books. I don't recall it being like in the movie. It was like literally like rooms just full of stacked books and stuff.
Essentially his own library.
Right, and so I don't know if were a lot of those books and stuff like outlawed as well, or is it
That's a fair question. I'd like to believe so, because I'd say in this particular society it's one that they want to keep its citizens as docile and unintelligent as possible.
Right.
So I'd say a lot of those thought-provoking books, especially on philosophy and politics and things like that, would be outlawed. And I believe even in the beginning of the film, he plays Tarkovsky's The Overture for blowing up the Old Bailey.
Right.
And so, of course, Adam Sutler, in the film, Chancellor Sutler, asks what was that heinous music, and one of the men that he's appointed says, I believe it was Tarkovsky's Overture.
Right.
And he says, I want that on the blacklist. And so you get an idea right away that over time they've been slowly, kind of almost like a Big Brother sense, where they make the news, they make the rules, you can read what they want you to read and listen to the music that they want you to listen to.
Exactly, and it really just shows you how drastic they've gone in this world to censor everything.
Right, all in an attempt to purport their image of perfection,
right,
or what they think is the pure society.
Exactly.
And then, of course, from there, we get to see Evie have this realization of, what have I done? Why did I attach myself to this person, V, this potential terrorist? What am I doing? Am I safe? Where am I at?
Right.
And, of course, in the film, he explains that he's going to have to be with her for a year because the government, the fingermen, are after her. They're looking for her. They're going to capture her, torture her, interrogate her.
Right, and that goes sucked. And I mean, it's great that he saved her and everything and is keeping her safe, but at the same time, to find out that now you're basically on the run and you're going to have to stay in this one place for at least a year, that's got to have an effect on you.
Oh, for sure. And it's one that, that they can tell that they're underground,
right.
somewhere away from the regular world and light in general.
Exactly.
And even as big as the Shadow Gallery is portrayed to be, like you said, after a year, I mean, you're probably going to be in every room. And yeah, there's a lot of books there to read and
right.
music to listen to, but still, it's like at a certain point, you would almost go stir crazy.
Oh, yeah. And it almost kind of gives you the impression that they probably added that amount of time to where you could reasonably think that she has been reading up on these different books and stuff that has been censored, so she has a bigger understanding of the world that she's living in.
Right, and that's a great point to bring up, because in the graphic novel especially, she mentions herself. Evie Hammond's character says, oh, I'm stupid, or I don't know. I'm just a 16-year-old girl. I don't know anything. I don't know what I'm doing here. And
right.
So he really, V in the graphic novel, takes her under his wing and helps to try to expand her mind and develop her and, let her know about the way that the world could be and how justice works and what the truth is and how to seek it and where to look for it.
Right.
How to recognize lies and things of that nature. And then so, of course, from there, it really takes off both in the graphic novel and the film, where he starts to, one of the V's is for vengeance. Mm-hmm. And so he goes out and takes care of all of those that wrongfully mistreated him at Lark Hill Detention Center, where they were essentially taking all of the unwanted citizens that had been doing medical experimentations on them.
Right.
That unfortunately had deadly effects. Of course, in the sense of V, he actually had his senses heightened and he was able to be strengthened by it. Of course, unfortunately, there were some adverse skin effects, and of course it had some mutation there, some burn wounds that were uncurable and untreatable, to the point that he actually mentally had forgotten who he was or where he was from.
Right.
And so the mythos behind V for Vendetta V, who he is he was actually in cell block Roman numeral V for 5.
Right.
And so that is kind of where he takes on that persona. He winds up getting his hands on some form of chemical agent that is flammable or combustible and winds up blowing his way out, quite literally, of Lark Hill Detention Center, and goes on a rampage in his mind of knowing, I'm coming after everybody that put me in this position, and I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to go full Monty and get this country turned on its head and back right the way that it should be.
Right.
And so, of course, from there, he goes after people like Commander Prothero or Louis Prothero, who, since his time as being a commander at Lark Hill, has moved on to become very wealthy, and also is the voice of London for the BTN and for the news station. And he also goes after a bishop that was a bishop at Lark Hill Detention Center. So all these people, of course, are benefiting from one another from a monetary standpoint, as they are key members or party members of this new established government. And so they're all, the rich just keep getting richer, so to speak. And so V has this hit list, and he's been going through it over the years, and now he's down to his last couple people, and so that being Prothero, this bishop, a botanist turned doctor who is also, I believe, a coroner in the film. But when he goes to the bishop, this is when Evie Hammond steps up and says, hey, I see what you're trying to do, and I understand now your mission for justice and the truth. I'd like to help in any way possible.
Right.
And so she kind of slyly does this, both in the graphic novel and in the film, because V says, actually, there's something you could help me with.
Right.
Because he plays upon the fact that the bishop in this particular setting of London is I believe, a pedophile at the end of the day.
That would be my guess, because, when she goes on this mission for V, she goes into this room, and I'm assuming, this preacher or bishop or whatever you want to say, I guess he basically has a arrangement where he has young girls come and meet him in his room, and so you see him in the room, Evie comes in, and she's in, a young schoolgirl type outfit, and it's really messed up, the whole scene, but at the same time, you think, so is this a bad guy or a good guy? And then you see what he's about. And I guess Evie, in saying that she trusted V now and wanted to help him on his quest, she also kind of had an ulterior motive of, I need to get away from this, and she's been held captive. And so she tries to get help from the bishop, and he basically acts like it's part of the game, or thinks it is, and so that doesn't really work out for her.
No, and she tries to confess and say, look, I've been held captive for the last few months by this vigilante terrorist known as V. He's on the way here to take you out. I fear for your life. If you could just please help me out or give me some sort of amnesty or protection.
Right.
And And like you said, he's not buying it. He thinks, oh, what a delightful game you're playing, and just goes along with it. And of course, next cutscene, next panel, V arrives to enact his vengeance, and she, of course, storms out apologizing, like, look, I had to do something. I've got to get out of this situation. And so, of course, he has no time to deal with her leaving. He has to deal with the task at hand, and that's taking out the bishop and crossing him off of his hit list. And so Evie ends up at the doorstep of Dietrich, who is a late-night talk show host, comedy host for the British television network.
Right.
And so he houses her, listens to her story, is glad that she's still alive, takes her in, and you start to see, at least in the film, that they kind of try to throw you a little bit with a misdirection in that his home is set up sort of in the same way that the Shadow Gallery is. He's got some illegal artwork. He's talking kind of in the way that V does.
Right.
And he brings up some points that V brought up her first night with V. And in the morning, he actually, oddly enough, makes the exact same breakfast item.
Right.
And so she's starting to think, like, wait a minute, maybe is Dietrich?
Is he V?
Is he V? Which, of course, he's not.
Right.
But it's just kind of nice that they threw that in there for the movie viewers. And so from there, that's where, of course, the Fingermen come back into the forefront, and they are well aware that Evie Hammond and V are on the loose. And, of course, Dietrich's character in the film, as a talk show host, makes some satirical material, and they do not like that at all. Not one bit. And in this totalitarian, oppressive style of government, they're going to stamp that out immediately.
Right.
So Creedy and his guys and Fingermen go over to his house, black bag him, take him out. And at that moment, Evie realizes, I've got to get the heck out of here. I've got to run again. I'm on the run. And at first we think that one of Creedy's Fingermen apprehend her.
Right.
And so in the graphic novel and in the film, when you're watching it and reading it for the first time, it just takes that turn and you're like, oh no, what's going to happen to Evie next?
Right.
And so what we see is a multi-panel and quite a bit of a scene-to-scene situation where she is captured, tortured, interrogated, broken down mentally. Her spirit is almost broken, and they're doing this on purpose to try and get the information that they want out of Evie. They say, we just need the whereabouts and information on Codename V, and we'll let you go. Are you aware that you right now are facing counts of murder, property damage, da-da-da? And so they just keep trying to get all this information out of her, and she's not cracking from her teachings from V.
Right.
And she just starts to wear down and whittle down, and she almost gets to that breaking point. And then you see this little crack, sort of a hole that's blocked out in the wall, just big enough for like a mouse or a rat. And for whatever reason, she's inclined to go over and investigate, and she happens to find a letter. And so this particular letter is written by who she thinks is a cellmate next door.
Right.
And so she's reading it, winds up being an autobiography from a lady called Valerie. Of course, appropriately, her name starts with a V.
Right.
Makes sense, very fitting. And so she very much so becomes attached to the idea of Valerie as being a person that once existed, and falls in love with her story and is very touched and moved by it. And it's a very moving story, both in the graphic novel and on film.
Right.
And so with that, she is offered that little sliver of hope. Because up until that point, she has none.
Right. Yeah, she's pretty messed up.
And speaking of messed up, so at the end of all of that, they finally come in and say, well, this is it. If you don't give us the information that we need, we're just going to take you back out by the chemical sheds and, end it.
Right.
And she's like, that's fine. I'm ready. I'm prepared. You can't do anything more to hurt me. Go for it. And so at that point, you hear the guard say, then you have nothing left to fear. You're free to go.
Right.
And so you're like, what?
Right.
Did he just say that she's free to go?
Yeah, and at that point, I was like, oh no, you're kidding. There's no way. And lo and behold.
Sure enough, in both the graphic novel and in the film, and this is one area where the film really got it right, is they show pretty much the same scene by scene, panel by panel, of her defeated, walking down this hallway, poking a fake plastic mannequin dressed in full police officer guard.
Right, looks like a guard outside of the cell that she was being held in.
Right, and then she gets out to the main door and realizes that it leads directly back to where else? The Shadow Gallery.
Right.
And V greets her as if it were a Tuesday.
Yeah, nothing.
Hey,
nothing wrong at all.
How's it going, Evie? And of course, that's where we see in the film and both in the graphic novel, Natalie Portman's character who plays Evie Hammond, and of course, well-inked Evie in the graphic novel by David Lloyd and Company. They both start to proclaim and shout and exclaim, you tortured me. You cut off all of my hair. You put me through all of this pain and suffering. You're a monster. I don't understand why anyone would do this.
Right.
And so, of course, V tries to comfort her and explain, I did this for a reason. The whole reason I put you through this was for you to understand what I went through, to get, at first I thought it was pain, I thought it was anger, but then I started to realize that a change needed to happen, and it was fear that I was letting hold me down, and now, you're empowered to be your own person and seek the truth, and you have no fear left. What you went through, yes, was real, but it was necessary.
Right, and it all turns out to be a test. And at that point, I mean, in my mind, I was like, wow, V is not a good guy.
And I have to say, he's very much so an anti-hero.
Right.
This is, if you're looking for a hero graphic novel, this isn't it.
No.
It's not one that really necessarily has much of a happy ending.
Yeah, and one interesting thing, this whole revelation that V set up this, I guess, prison-like scenario for Evie was, if he did set it all up, did he make up the girl before her that wrote the letter to her? Was any of that real? I mean, it helped her get through being held captive, and if the cell is in his house, then it would make sense that V set all of that up and maybe made her up, or else she was somebody else that was being held captive at the same place that V was being held captive. So it just kind of, it leaves you not sure what's real and what's not.
No, and really, it's one of those where you think if he orchestrated this faux prison in the Shadow Gallery, it's not hard to believe that he did conceptualize a person out of thin air,
Right.
write the letter himself, because we see in the film and the graphic novel this particular prisoner named Valerie that's supposedly next to her, the cellmate of V, originally at Larkhill.
Right.
Reaching into this toilet, getting out some toilet paper, which of course brings into question, where did she get a pen or some kind of instrument to write with?
Right.
But nevertheless, and then, to your point, it could very well be that maybe, potentially, if you want to talk about a theory for V for Vendetta here for a moment, could very well be that V himself manifested Valerie out of necessity to give himself hope to make it out of Larkhill.
Right.
But still, it's implied in both the graphic novel and the film that this is actually a real person, in the sense that V has a movie poster in the Shadow Gallery that has Valerie posted with her name, and Evie even comments and says, oh my gosh, she was actually a real person. Because I believe there's a moment there in the film and the graphic novel where Evie's character has that same realization that we just talked about, in that what was real, what wasn't.
Right.
And she questions the note and was like, was that you? Did you write that? And he tells her, like, no, she was a real person, and more or less she was part of the driving reason for his vengeance.
True.
But again,
he could be making up everything.
Right. He could need that as a necessity in his mind to do or to justify the things that he does.
Right.
So it's a great concept, and again, something that I really appreciated both in the film and in the graphic novel.
Right.
And so from there, we really come to a climactic peak, and then the downswing at the end of both the graphic novel and the film, in that after Evie's rebirth, which is neat because you get sort of a back and forth, her going on the rooftop, raising her hands in the rain, much in the same way that V rose his hands out of the fire.
Right.
So that was kind of a nice similarity. And so they go from there to enacting his full-on 5th of November has arrived. It's time. It's Judgment Day. Chaos is starting to flood the streets of London, and the government isn't quite able to handle it. They try to handle it, quote, in the best way that they know how. And we start to notice that the way that they've been doing things is crumbling, and this revolution is right on the cusp of busting loose.
Right.
And we get a very iconic scene where Evie is completely imbued with this new sense of empowerment. She's not afraid of this establishment anymore. She's fully ready to help V this one last time and complete the mission. And so in the movie, they meet up in a subway, because that's where they're going to load up this subway cart train, all the explosives and fireworks that they can, and quite literally blow up Parliament. Whereas in the graphic novel, it's a little bit slightly different. It's the same concept, but they're more so looking for him to make an appearance, make a big speech, and then rise above and have this resolution. And eventually, they're still going to blow up Parliament, but just happens at different moments in the graphic novel and the film.
Right.
But we still get that same iconic scene of him going into the sewer. Of course, here is another difference between the graphic novel and the film. In the graphic novel, V is actually met and approached by Detective Finch, which is a big moment for his character in the graphic novel, for his character arc, because up until that moment, he's pretty well been a by-the-book detective for this particular form of government.
Right.
And he is a government man. But when he meets V, and I think even leading up to that, he's sort of questioning himself as to, am I the good guy? Is he the good guy? Am I the bad guy? Is he the bad guy?
Right.
And he reaffirms himself of, no, I'm going to take him in by the letter. And he tries to do that by shooting at V, and, just does not have any success, so he thinks.
Right.
And V tells him, did you think that there was just flesh and this mask under this cloak? Like, no, there's an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. Now, of course, the big difference in the film is it's not Finch at all. It's actually Creedy, who's head of the Fingermen, who meets him in the sewerway there with Adam Sutler, because in working with Detective Finch, V convinces him to put Creedy under full surveillance so that he can get close. And then, of course, Hugo Weaving finds him in his flower greenhouse room and says, a man as smart as you understands that this empire is about to come toppling down. Sutler is going to be on his way out, and that'll leave room for you to take over.
Right.
And if you want to do that, bring him to me. We'll take him out. And then, of course, Creedy stops him and says, now, why in the world would I do that? And, of course, V is sly, and he says, well, that's the only way that you're going to get to me.
Right.
Meaning, I'm going to be a problem forever, even if you take over. Newsflash.
True.
And so, of course, Creedy thinks, okay, well, I'll take out Sutler and you and take over London. All the while, V understanding and realizing, no, I'm going to take you both out and cut the head of the snake off at the source. And so we get this super cool scene, I'm sure that was probably written up by the Wachowskis, where it's just V against, I don't want to say a small army, but a number of guards and Creedy. And of course, Creedy drops the line of, what are you going to do? You've got your knives and your karate gimmicks. We've got guns and we've got bullets. And V, of course, says, no, what you have are bullets. And the hope that once you've fired them all, I'm no longer standing.
Right.
And so just a really cool scene there. He, of course, does his thing, gets to Creedy. Creedy continues to reload and try and shoot him and asks, why won't you die? And he drops the same line of, beneath this mask and cloak are more than flesh and blood. It's an idea. Ideas are bulletproof. Right. So he winds up taking out Creedy, whereas Finch, more or less in the graphic novel, thinks that he's actually, quote-unquote, killed V, because V is bleeding noticeably after their encounter, but he walks off and walks away. And so for Finch, I think in his mind, he's like, I've done it. I've taken out this masked vigilante.
Right.
And in both instances, V gets back to Evie. A little bit different, again, in the graphic novel and the film, in the sense that one situation, V gets back to the subway launch pad there, and Evie has a heartfelt goodbye and realizes, she still has to. He leaves the choice up to her, ultimately, as to how the revolution's going to start, and of course she chooses to give him a Viking funeral, send him off to blow up Parliament with all the fireworks and the bombs. In the graphic novel, it's much more important because he goes back to the Shadow Gallery, kind of where it all began for both of them, and he says, you're going to have to, I want you to try and start this revolution, but I also want you to see who's under this mask and understand who's under this mask, but I don't want you to know my face. Is that clear? And I think for me, the way I took that, what he meant by that is I want you to understand the premise of why I'm doing this, why I'm wearing the mask, what I stand for.
Right.
But I don't want you to necessarily associate that with one person.
Right.
It can. The theory is it can be anybody.
Right. And I think the meaning of that is that it, like you said, it's an idea. It's a way of thinking versus an actual person, any one person. So it kind of leaves you with the thought that Evie will probably be taking over the mantle of V and continuing it on from there as V.
And that's exactly what happens in the graphic novel. She, we get this really cool panel by panel scene of where she sees him as her father, she sees him as herself, essentially once she actually gets to him, takes off the mask.
Right.
And she has this little smile in the last panel, that realization of, okay, I know what he meant. And she more or less takes up that mantle, still gives the speech, and shows everybody, because I believe in the graphic novel there towards the end, they're trying to report that it's over, the terrorist is dead, we've thwarted his efforts, go back to your homes and return to normalcy. And she gives a speech completely reversing all of that and letting the people know, hey, the time is now.
Right.
This establishment has crumbled. Let's rebuild it the way that we see fit and do it in a just way and seek the truth and let the truth have its day.
Definitely.
And then the graphic novel, essentially from there, comes to a close, as does the film. And a real neat way that the film ends is it's, of course, Evie and Detective Finch watching Parliament implode and fireworks going off in this beautiful display. And he says, well, who was he? And Evie says, well, he was Edmund Dantes, which, of course, if you watch the film, you know that that's one of the main characters from The Count of Monte Cristo. And then she says, he was my brother, he was my father, he was my mother, he was me, he was you. Again, driving home the fact, essentially, V is everyone.
Right.
And then you go through all of the crowd that's there for the big display, and everyone takes off their mask, and you see some familiar sub-characters that were throughout the entire film. And it's interesting because the last set of characters that you see are some of the ones that actually passed away in the film, or so we were led to believe.
Right.
And so that goes back to the whole, well, maybe they actually didn't pass away,
Right.
and V just needed to think that in order to enact all of these plans. So it's kind of from a theory standpoint, it's like, oh, well, maybe they actually made it, or they very well may have chosen to show them last because they're no longer with us, and so they're, quote, they're in spirit.
But it kind of gives you the idea of it's just another way of saying what was real, what wasn't, and yeah, I mean, it's just a cool little nod and leaves you with questions.
And so with that, Charlie, I think we have to, just like we did with the Watchmen series, go ahead and give V for Vendetta, I guess we should break it up, V for Vendetta, to be fair, do the Nerdy by Nature ranking for V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, and then do a Nerdy by Nature ranking for V for Vendetta, the movie.
Okay. I guess I'll start, and honestly, like we've talked about off camera a couple times, this particular story didn't, I guess, resonate quite as much as for me as it did for you. Which is one of the reasons why you pretty much led this conversation. I mean, I didn't dislike it by any means, but it just wasn't necessarily the story for me. I will say that the graphic novel, I would probably give a 4 out of 5, just because it's the whole thing and it feels a lot more fleshed out and a lot easier to follow and grasp the concepts and everything about the story. The movie, I would say, was probably more like a 3, if I'm honest, just because I don't feel like it went near as far as it needed to, and it didn't feel like it flowed quite as well as the graphic novel.
I think that's a fair review for both. I'd have to agree on the graphic novel standpoint for all of the same reasons. And I would give it a 4 as well, because it was so well written by Alan Moore, inked beautifully by David Lloyd and Company. And even though the imagery wasn't quite as bright as what we got in The Watchmen, I mean, don't get me wrong, The Watchmen is still dark as far as content, but the actual imagery was quite beautiful to look at. Whereas I think purposefully the images that we got in V for Vendetta were more pale, and I think that's because of the scenery and the setting. We were in a very oppressive, not very vibrant environment, so I think that was done on purpose for sure. But still just a classic, iconic follow-up to an already iconic graphic novel in The Watchmen. So it's one of those that if you haven't read it, we highly recommend that you pick up a copy. You can find this trade paperback for $20 in most comic book shops or online.
Definitely.
And in some cases, if you're into this, you can actually find versions that will have the Guy Fawkes mask that comes with it. So it's kind of a cool collector's item as well. But for me, with the movie, I've got to give it a 3.5, strictly because while it was a little disjointed at times, and it certainly was a watered-down version of the graphic novel, and led more to be desired, and I think it could have been fleshed out a little bit better than what it was.
Right.
I have to give props to Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman's job acting-wise, because they really anchored the movie, and it's hard to imagine somebody else being V. And I'll also say this, we've talked about this before, when I read a graphic novel or a comic book series, I like to try to put a different voice to a different character for each bubble. And having watched, fully admit, full disclosure, I watched the movie first, then watched the graphic novel. And so
you watched the graphic novel?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did. Watched it all. Hold on. Page to cover to cover. So having watched the movie and read the graphic novel afterwards, I enjoyed it more so because not only is, of course, is the graphic novel better than the movie, but being able to hear Hugo Weaving's voice as V throughout the graphic novel just amplified it tenfold. So that's where the half a star comes from. But I don't think I would ever give V for Vendetta a 4 or 5 because there was a big part that bothered me that I didn't talk about earlier in the podcast, and that was John Hurt's portrayal of Adam Sutler. And nothing against John Hurt, fantastic actor, rest his soul. He's a very talented guy. But the way that they had him portray Adam Sutler in the film sort of discredited his character in the graphic novel in a way, because he was just this belligerent, over-the-top, yelling dictator that was going to take over London and any cost. And when you read the graphic novel, Adam Susan, the Chancellor in the graphic novel, is definitely a power-hungry individual, but he's got this sort of intimate relationship with fate, the omni machine that he's come up with to surveil and monitor all of his citizens, and so he's quite literally in love with power.
Right.
And so he's not just this, crazy madman that rose to power from being belligerent and oppressive per se. There was more of a rhyme and reason or method to his madness, and so I think some of that got lost in John Hurt's character. But otherwise, a solid film, and I can easily see why it's a cult classic. So for me, I would say 3.5, and that half again mostly going towards Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman's abilities as an actor and actress.
Right. Agreed.
And so with that, that's actually going to wrap up this edition of Nerdy by Nature. As always, we thank you for listening. Be sure to hit the like button, share, and by all means, feel free to comment, and we're happy to comment back. Let us know what we got right. Let us know what we got wrong. If you want to hear certain content or have certain episodes be done, feel free to leave suggestions as well. And for our next episode, since it's been a little bit since we've done a movie review, we've been a little graphic novel heavy, we're going to go back into that realm. Zombieland actually just hit on Netflix, the first one, and of course Zombieland 2 has been in theaters for a little bit now, and so we're going to go ahead and do a review of the Zombieland series, so both One and Double Tap. They're both funny, just well done zombie films. It's a shame that we had to wait 10 years to get this sequel,
right?
But it was well done, and we don't want to give away too much. We'll leave a little teaser here for our next episode, but Zombieland, the series, 1 and 2 is what we'll be going over in our next episode, so be on the lookout for that. And again, appreciate you guys listening. All the love from your boys. This is Agent Smith signing off.
And I'm Captain Rogers. God bless.